November 1944, a frontline outpost near Saarlautern, Germany. Rain turns the Saar Valley into a gray wasteland of freezing mud and jagged slate. The air tastes of wet iron and charcoal. 7 American soldiers lie motionless in a field of dead grass. Just 300 yards from their starting point. 3 will never move again. 4 are screaming or gasping, their blood steaming in the cold morning air. Back at the command post, a young officer stares at a map, his boots still shining, his collar crisp. He is explaining why his chart and his textbooks were right, even as the stretchers begin to arrive. He believes in the geometry of the direct approach. He believes his honors degree from OCS carries more weight than the dirt under a sergeant's fingernails. But George Patton is coming, and he is about to prove that what happens when arrogance writes the orders is a debt paid in blood. This is the story of a decorated veteran sergeant whose survival instincts were overruled by a replacement officer obsessed with textbooks, and the high-cost lesson General Patton forced that officer to learn. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happens when old hierarchies met new realities. By joining us, you help ensure these moments of battlefield justice are never forgotten. Sergeant First Class Eddie Kowalski was 34 years old. He came from the south side of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where the winters were hard and the work at the iron foundry was harder. He had 15 years of service under his belt, long enough to remember the horse cavalry and the lean years of the Great Depression. Kowalski had lived through the chaos of Omaha Beach, the claustrophobic terror of the Normandy hedgerows, and the frantic race across the face of France. He was a man of few words and deep instincts. He looked at a map and saw more than lines. He saw where the water pooled, where the shadows lengthened at dusk, and where a German machine gunner would likely set his sights. To his men, he was the difference between a letter home and a ride in a pine box. He carried the weight of 3 campaigns in the set of his shoulders and the permanent squint of his eyes. On this morning, he stood in the rain, his grease-stained field jacket, heavy with moisture, watching a boy who had never seen a dead body tell him how to fight a war. That boy was Second Lieutenant Bradley Marsh. He was 22 years old, born into the quiet privilege of Greenwich, Connecticut. His father was a partner at a Manhattan law firm, and his mother's family had roots that reached back to the Mayflower. Marsh had graduated from officer candidate school just 4 weeks prior. He arrived at the front with honors, a silver bar that gleamed even in the gloom, and a set of jump boots polished to a mirror shine. He viewed the war as a series of problems to be solved with the precise application of modern doctrine. To Marsh, the veterans were tired and stuck in their ways, bogged down by a caution he mistook for cowardice. He believed the manual was the supreme authority. He told the sergeant that he appreciated his experience, but that he had studied the latest patrol tactics at OCS, and they would be doing things his way. He was a man who had been in the country for 24 hours, and he was convinced he was the smartest person in the valley. The Saar River Valley in late 1944 was a meat grinder of static warfare and sudden, violent death. The American Third Army had pushed across France with record speed, but as the winter rains arrived, the momentum stalled against the rugged terrain and the fortified pillboxes of the Siegfried Line. Saarlautern was a city of stone houses and narrow streets, now reduced to a skeleton of rubble, where every basement was a potential bunker. The German defenders were no longer the retreating remnants of the summer. They were fighting on their own doorstep, backed by thick forests and meticulously mapped kill zones. In this environment, the difference between a safe route and a death trap was often a matter of inches. Small unit leaders were the masters of their own fate. Division headquarters could draw lines on a map, but they couldn't see the sniper nest in a third-story window or the tripwire hidden in a blackberry patch. Replacement officers were arriving by the hundreds to fill the gaps left by the staggering casualties of the fall campaigns. These young men were often products of an accelerated training program that prioritized speed and aggressive movement over the slow, grinding reality of attrition. Many veteran non-commissioned officers watched with quiet dread as these newcomers arrived, terrified that a lack of local knowledge would prove more dangerous than the enemy. Usually, a company commander would step in to pair a green lieutenant with a seasoned sergeant to keep him from making a fatal mistake. But in the chaos of the Saar front, sometimes things slipped through the cracks. Sometimes a man with 24 hours in the mud was given the power of life and death over men who had seen it all. The morning fog was thick, masking the field where the mistake was about to be made. The morning air hung heavy with the smell of wet earth and exhaust, as Sergeant Kowalski stood by the jeep, tapping a folded map against his thigh. He watched Lieutenant Marsh approach. The young man's uniform so clean it looked out of place against the backdrop of shattered brick and gray mud. Kowalski cleared his throat and pointed to a jagged line on the map. He explained that for the last 3 months, they had used the creek bed to the south. He noted it was wet and slow, but the ridge provided a natural screen against the German machine gun nests in the heights. It was a route he had walked a dozen times without losing a single man. Marsh didn't even look at the ridge. He adjusted his glasses and traced a straight line across an open meadow toward the target objective. He told the sergeant that the creek bed was an unnecessary delay. He stated that the latest patrol doctrine emphasized speed and momentum over cautious flanking. Kowalski shook his head, his voice low and steady. He told the lieutenant that the field was a shooting gallery. He said the Germans had the range dialed in, and the grass wasn't high enough to hide a dog, let alone a squad. Marsh looked up from the map, his expression tightening with a sudden, sharp arrogance. He told Kowalski that while he appreciated the input from an experienced non-com, he had spent the last several months studying at the best tactical school in the world. He said he was there to bring the unit up to modern standards, not to wallow in the habits of the previous year. Kowalski took a step forward. His jaw set. He told the lieutenant that the Germans didn't care about the latest doctrine from Connecticut. He said that field was a graveyard waiting to happen. Marsh's face flushed red. He stepped into the sergeant's personal space, his voice rising just enough to be heard by the men nearby. He told Kowalski that he was the officer in charge. He stated that he had honors from OCS and a commission from the president, which meant his judgment was final. He told the sergeant to stop obstructing the mission with his hesitation. Kowalski looked at the men of the platoon, then back at the boy with the silver bar. He asked the lieutenant if he was sure he wanted to gamble 7 lives on a textbook. Marsh didn't blink. He told the sergeant that they were taking the direct route because it was faster and more aggressive. He told Kowalski to get the men ready to move out immediately. Kowalski didn't argue further. He knew the look of a man who couldn't be told anything. He watched the patrol march into the open. 20 minutes later, the air was torn apart by the rhythmic hammer of MG-42s. When the smoke cleared, the casualty report was sent up the chain. It reached Patton's headquarters within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. The roar of a high-compression engine cut through the low morning fog before the jeep even came into view. It skidded to a halt in the mud of the command post, the oversized metal stars on the bumper and the red plates catching what little light remained. Patton stepped out, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the gray sky. He wore his full-service uniform, 4 stars gleaming on his helmet, and the legendary ivory-handled revolvers buckled tight to his waist. He didn't speak as he walked into the small stone building. He didn't have to. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Every officer and clerk snapped to attention, their eyes locked forward. Patton ignored the salutes. He walked straight to the map table and stared at the red lines Lieutenant Marsh had drawn. He stood there for a long minute, his jaw working, the silence becoming a physical weight. Then, his voice came, quiet and terrifyingly thin. Patton looked at Marsh and asked if he was the officer who had authorized the patrol. Marsh stood as straight as a rod and confirmed that he was. Patton then asked if the lieutenant had been briefed by the platoon sergeant on the previous routes taken through that sector. Marsh replied that he had been briefed, but he had found the sergeant's methods to be outdated. Patton took a step closer, his eyes narrowing, and asked if the lieutenant had seen the 3 men who were currently being tagged for burial. Marsh swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the silence, and said he had seen them, but that casualties were a statistical reality of the direct approach taught at the academy. Patton leaned over the map, his gloved finger hovering just above the open field where the men had died. He said that the academy teaches a man how to read a map, but the dirt teaches a man how to stay alive. He looked at Marsh and told him that OCS had given him the fundamentals, but Sergeant Kowalski had earned a doctorate in survival over 3 bloody campaigns. He said that the sergeant knew every shadow and every ditch in that valley, the lieutenant because he had bled in them, while the lieutenant was still practicing his salute in Connecticut. He pointed out that Marsh's first act of leadership was not to learn from the men who knew the ground, but to kill them with his own vanity. He told the lieutenant that he had mistaken his rank for wisdom and his textbook for a shield. He said that in the Third Army, they didn't have room for officers who thought they were too smart to listen to the men holding the rifles. He then gave Marsh a choice. He could be relieved of command and face a board of inquiry for negligence, or he could spend the next 30 days as a shadow. He told the lieutenant he would run every single patrol behind Sergeant Kowalski. He would carry the radio. He would crawl in the mud. He would learn every ditch, every shadow, and every danger point. He said Marsh would not give a single order, nor would he even speak, until Kowalski decided he was finally ready to lead. Marsh looked at the general, his face pale, and whispered that he understood. Patton told him he hoped he did, because the next mistake would be his last. The order was executed before the morning mist had even cleared from the valley floor. Marsh was stripped of his sidearm and his map case, replaced with a heavy field radio and a mud-caked pack. Under the watchful eyes of the entire regiment, the young lieutenant took his place, 3 paces behind Sergeant Kowalski. The veterans watched in a heavy, expectant silence as the pair moved out toward the very field where the 3 men had fallen just hours before. Marsh's boots, once polished to a high shine, disappeared into the thick, freezing sludge of the Saar. He felt the weight of the radio straps cutting into his shoulders, a physical reminder of the lives he had disregarded. Every time he tried to stand too tall or move too quickly, Kowalski's hand would shoot back, shoving him down into the freezing water of the drainage ditches. The lieutenant smelled the metallic tang of spent shell casings and the lingering scent of smoke. He saw the craters where his men had died. He heard the whistle of distant mortars and felt the spray of dirt against his cheek as he lay face down, in the same mud he had previously looked down upon from a distance. He was no longer an officer with a degree. He was a shadow, a silent student of the man he had dared to overrule. Eddie Kowalski stayed in the Army until 1959. Retiring as a sergeant major, he returned to Milwaukee and took a job as a safety inspector for the same iron foundry he had left before the war. He never bragged about the men he saved or the lieutenant he humbled. He died in 1988 at the age of 78, surrounded by a family that only knew he had been a soldier because of the bronze star on his mantle. To his last day, he always walked the perimeter of a parking lot rather than cutting across the open center. Bradley Marsh survived his 30 days as a shadow. He emerged from the mud of the Saar Valley a fundamentally different man. He served out the remainder of the war with a quiet, almost obsessive attention to the advice of his senior NCOs. After the war, he returned to Connecticut and became a successful civil engineer, a career dedicated to the precise study of ground and stability. He never mentioned the names of the 3 men he killed in 1944 to his colleagues, but he kept a piece of a jagged slate from Saarlautern on his desk until his death in 2002. It served as a paperweight for every blueprint he ever signed. General Patton never officially recorded the incident in his personal diaries, preferring to let the lesson live in the blood and bone of the regiment. He mentioned it only once in a private letter to a fellow general, noting that a silver bar is just a piece of metal until it has been dragged through the same dirt as a private's rifle. He believed that the quickest way to forge a leader was to strip away his pride and replace it with the cold, hard weight of reality. For Patton, the cost of 3 lives was a tragedy, but the cost of an unlearned lesson was an army's ruin. What Patton did. When a one-day officer overruled a 3-campaign sergeant and got men killed November 1944. A frontline outpost near Saarlautern, Germany, rain turns the earth into a thick, gray slurry that clings to boots and soles alike. A weary platoon huddles in a shallow trench, watching the tree line for any flicker of movement. They have walked these woods for months. They know where the shadows hide teeth. But today, a fresh face holds the map. A young officer arrives with crisp bars on his shoulders and the ink still wet on his commission. He looks at the mud and sees a geometric problem. He looks at the veteran sergeant and sees an obstacle to efficiency. He points a gloved finger at a wide open field and demands a direct approach. By sunset, the grass will be stained red, and 3 mothers will receive telegrams. George S. Patton will soon ensure the man responsible learns that in combat, Arrogance is a terminal condition. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have court-martialed the lieutenant immediately? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the truth behind the myths of military glory, make sure to subscribe.